So the life of an iPhone, while it is in some ways it begins at Foxconn or a Pegatron factory, I think it really begins even earlier than that. Before they're assembled there are all of these components that are made by individual suppliers or provided by individual suppliers. And so, I think some people have done very well investing in iPhone component manufacturers. I think it kind of makes sense to discuss a couple of them here that you're particularly interested in, that you think are, worth talking about. So, one of the first ones that comes to mind for me is Corning, and they are the manufacturers of Gorilla Glass, which is the glass that is on the front of the iPhone. It's the one that your finger touches all the time, and the one that Steve Jobs famously insisted on.
Yeah, I remember the story was like he had the original prototype, which had like a plastic screen in his pocket, and it kept getting scratched up. And then like 6 months or 6 weeks or it was some ridiculous timeline before the unveiling. He was like, "Hey, we need to go make this happen," which is again kind of ties back into the whole like engineering talent thing they were talking about earlier, because like they needed to make this change within such a short period of time that you need to have an army of mid-level manufacturing engineers that can put this together and from a manufacturing perspective to actually make this happen. And probably wouldn't have been possible in the U.S. with the kind of talent that we have here. But yeah, I mean, then of course now Gorilla Glass is like the standard feature in all high-end smartphones. So Apple really kind of like brought this thing back from the dead because this technology had been like 60 years old and Corning had no idea what to do with it because there was no market for it. And then all of a sudden Apple's like, "Hey," and then they created a market for this product. And now I think they're on Gorilla Glass 4, I think, or something. Of course they improve the glass every few generations or so. But yeah, I mean it's so common nowadays.
Yeah, I think if I remember the story correctly, Steve Jobs said, people are going to have this in their pocket with keys, and the keys are going to scratch plastic. We need to have something else. And so enter Corning, right? And I'm sure they're very happy to be an Apple provider. Although there was a period where it looked like they weren't going to be an Apple provider, right? It seemed like Apple was going to be pivoting over to GTAT at one point.
Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about the whole Sapphire thing, which has its merits, but also has its downsides. I mean, there are pros and cons to switching to it. I mean, it's more scratch resistant, but it's also more brittle, so it actually shatters easier than Gorilla Glass.
And that was one of the problems in manufacturing it, right? And one of the reasons that GTAT did not pan out as an Apple supplier.
Right, and also one thing I'll mention about Corning is that when it comes to being an Apple supplier, because being an Apple supplier is such like a legitimate investing strategy nowadays. But I think Corning, it's like their specialty materials division that includes Gorilla Glass, which is only like 10 or 15% of sales. So Corning's not really a good candidate if you're going in saying, "Hey, I want to buy an Apple supplier that has a lot of exposure to Apple," because they don't have like a ton of exposure. I mean, the rest of their business is like making other glass products like beakers or science things and like all these other things that have use for glass. So their exposure to Apple is actually pretty modest in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, they are not your conventional tech supplier. I mean, they've been around
Right.
for over 100 years at this point, and have a lot of operations in the U.S. I know they used to produce the glass in the U.S. and have since moved a lot of those operations over to Asia. I think part of the idea there is to just be closer to the contract manufacturing that's happening.
Right. Especially for Gorilla Glass, I mean, it's just so popular in consumer tech these days.
Yeah. So we touched on it a little bit, but can you give some background on the cautionary tale of GTAT and some of the struggles of being an Apple supplier?
Yeah, so GTAT is probably the best example of why being an Apple supplier is really this double-edged sword. Because, I mean, GT announced this giant deal with Apple. I forget all the specific numbers since it's been a couple of years, but I mean, basically they announced this huge deal with Apple where they would sell Apple the Sapphire material, whereas GT had historically they always made the furnace for the Sapphire. They didn't actually make the Sapphire itself. So what they did is they would make the furnace and they would sell it to other companies that actually operate the furnaces and make the Sapphire, sell the material. So GT had never actually had experience making the material in a large volume. They've only made the equipment to make the material. And this deal with Apple was basically asking them to switch their entire business model to create and sell a ton of the actual material. So Apple would, basically be buying a ton of Sapphire at below market rates. But it was such a massive deal that GT kind of like, I think they got kind of caught up in the storyline and they knew that it's sexy to be an Apple supplier, so they kind of signed on board. But even without having much experience in this kind of model of operation that Apple's asking for, because Apple originally said we were going to buy the furnaces, but then they kind of swapped and they're like, oh no, we just want the material, and they set this whole like agreement up where they're going to build this plant in I think Mesa, Arizona, and they're going to like operate it. But like Apple inserted themselves in this process at so many points, so like you had like, and plus the deal was so asymmetrical, like Corning or not Corning, GT basically took on all the risk associated with this. Apple took on very little risk.
They did provide some financing, though. I believe it was like $500 million to build that facility.
So they basically offered to have these prepayments, right? So they had these 4 installments of like prepayments of the total. I forget. I think it was like 800 million or something like that. And basically at each there's these different milestones that GT has to hit to get these prepayments. And the prepayments are used because someone needs to help fund the capex of building this facility and making all these furnaces. But GT was going to still be the owner of the furnaces, so it's a ton of money that they don't really have the time to just like go and do this. So Apple's like prepaying them, and they're like getting to all these milestones. And what those prepayments do is Apple gets to prepay, and that's basically a credit that they use that they were planning to use as payment for Sapphire later on. So it's like, we'll prepay you now, then they can use the money to build this thing up, and then once they start outputting Sapphire, then they just start delivering some Sapphire to Apple, and it kind of like it's like a big tab. So then they owe all the Sapphire, and it just became such a mess because Apple executives are overseeing GT engineers and like trying to tell them what to do, but Apple has no idea how to do this stuff either. So it's like, and like I remember reading through some of the bankruptcy filings, and it's just like GT's like, hey, we need spare backup power generators because if the power goes out, we can lose hundreds of $1,000s worth of these boules in a batch. And and Apple's like, no, we don't want to do that. And it's like, what? And then the power went out like 2 or 3 times. Like, so you just have this whole mess of like, they're basically like betting the entire company on this deal. Like, it's really not a far stretch to say that, particularly in light of like the fact that they felt trapped by Apple. They felt that they were like completely trapped in this deal, and the only way to get themselves out was to declare bankruptcy, which they did. And I mean, of course, like if you look at the timing of some of the GT executives, they were cashing out some of their stock when the stock was high. When right after the deal was announced, it's like, oh, everyone's excited. Apple deal, Apple supplier deal. So stock goes up, and you see GT insiders starting to cash out, and then 6-12 months later they declare bankruptcy. It's just it's a little shady, and
yeah.
I think they definitely they bit off way too much, way more than they could chew, and GT shareholders got burned pretty bad. I mean, they literally went bankrupt.
If you're looking for a visual representation of how things went for GT, I would just search for the boules themselves online in Google Images, because they have these 100-pound boules of sapphire that are cracked and unusable for manufacturing purposes because it was something that was out of their competency. It wasn't in their wheelhouse to be manufacturing these.
And now you have Apple saying, hey, we want a ton of it. And yeah, it was just such a huge change. It's like, why would you think you could do this? And I mean, of course, at the time, that's what was leading all the speculation that they're going to use sapphire as a cover glass for the iPhone, despite it being more brittle and all these some trade-offs. I mean, they still use sapphire on the Touch ID home button and as a camera cover glass thing, but those are 2 pretty small pieces compared to like the front panel.
Yeah, the risk of that cracking is much lower.
It's like, I mean, people drop their phones all the time, and and Sapphire's more expensive too. So, there's that too. So that's another downside. So,
yeah,
I mean, it's kind of a trade-off. It's like, what's more important, scratch resistance or cracking resistance? I mean, no one likes scratching their phones, but no one likes, if you drop your phone, you don't want it to crack like instantly at the same time. So it's kind of a debatable which one is more important, because Gorilla Glass is better at one and Sapphire is better at the other.
So I think the lesson for investors with GT-AT is if you're looking to play companies that are acting as Apple suppliers, see how reliant they are on Apple as a business and see that they are operating within a competency that they're used to being in, right?
Right. It was such a bad deal.